Now, let's talk about religion in North Africa before Christianity and before Islam. Information I get from other sources, not Herodotus histories, because histories was written before Christianity and before Islam. They talk about the North Africa having Christianity widespread in the cities and towns, Egypt, Tunisia, those regions having huge populations of people who became Christians at some point. And in fact, we now have Coptics in Egypt who are like the remnants of that population. But before Christianity, I used to imagine that before Christianity, there were these local religions, local indigenous religions among the people. But reading Herodotus' book, I come to find out that no, not really. The religions in North Africa, and in fact, in Africa, especially um, almost half of Africa that was known in the ancient world were not local religions. And it then hit me that some of the practices we see today among African tribes that we call their local practices, religious practices, were not really local. These were practices that were practiced outside there. For example, I'll give you an example of a practice that I've noted that comes up a lot in Herodotus' book Histories, especially when he talks about the Greek religion. And this is the practice of sacrificing animals. And then, of course, there's sacrificing animals all over the place in Africa and the rest of the world. But it's a specific practice of killing the animal and then looking at its internal organs and trying to read some messages from that. That is something that some tribes in Kenya have done till very recent, killing goats in particular, and then trying to read the internal organs for some signs. I think if you go to South Sudan or Sudan, there are tribes that are practicing that to date very much heavily. So that is interesting. I used to think those were local practices that are real African. They didn't come from outside, or they've not gone outside, because I don't want to say that the Greeks are the ones who gave Africans those practices. It's possible that the Greeks picked those practices from Africans, because reading Herodotus' book, he does mention so many things that the Greeks learned from Africans, from Egyptians. Yeah, so religion in North Africa or in Africa before Islam and Christianity is very interesting. When you read Herodotus' book, then you realize that he mentions that most tribes in Libya, okay, in another part of the book, he does handle very well the religion in Egypt, and I think I've created a video about that, where you realize the gods that Egyptians worshipped were the same gods that Greeks worshipped, but the Greeks had different names for those same gods, and the Egyptians had different names, but they were basically the same gods. And then Herodotus does mention that the Greeks picked the gods from the Egyptians, the gods that the Greeks worshipped, the ancient Greeks. They picked those gods from the Egyptians. They just gave them different names. In fact, Herodotus does tell us that the first oracles in Greekland in fact, he mentions specifically that the first oracle in Greekland was a black lady. They called up the Black Dove. I've created a video about this, and she came from, I think, Thebes. So they copied the religion to Greece, and then other European tribes did copy the Greeks. They had the same thing happened in Europe, by the way. There are different tribes, Scythians and all these other tribes. They worship the same gods as the Greeks, but they had different names for them. And then, of course, they had local customization of these of the practices of sacrifice, the kind of animals they sacrifice, how they did it. Herodotus gives us all these details, and so it's so interesting. Coming back to Africa, so the Egyptians are the source of these gods that the Greeks worship, but these gods also go to the rest of Africa. Herodotus tells us that Ethiopians worshipped Zeus, Apollo, those gods. They had temples for them, and that was so interesting. It's something that I never imagined. When I heard of Zeus, Apollo, whatever those gods, I always thought of them being in Europe, Greece, and the surrounding region. I never imagined that there were places in Africa where they had temples for those gods. Now, when Herodotus tells us about the tribes that lived in Libya, which is basically Africa to him, although it was much of North Africa and the Sahel, he does mention these gods, every tribe. It happened that these tribes will worship in general all the gods that the Greeks worshipped, or most of them, but then they will have preferences for specific gods. And then in some cases they will have their own new gods, but if you interrogated more, you found that those new gods were still based on either Egyptian or Greek gods. For example, there is this god called Minerva that was worshipped a lot by tribes to the west and south of Egypt. It turns out it was Athene, goddess Athene, to the Greeks. So in general, Herodotus tells us the gods that were worshipped most by Libyans were Triton. In fact, there was a big lake that was in the region of Morocco, Algeria, that region. It was a very big lake, and there also was a river. And the lake was called Tritonis, and the river was called River Triton. So they worshipped Triton, it's a Greek god, Neptune, Minerva, I mentioned Jupiter. And now that made me start questioning this understanding that these were Greek gods. It comes across, or it seems to me by reading Herodotus, that these were not like per se Greek gods. They were gods that were worshipped everywhere, most part. They were even worshipped in Babylon, in Persia. Whenever he talks about Babylon, Persia, even Arabia, he mentioned, I'm forgetting the gods that the Arabs used to worship, but they were still the same gods that the Greeks were worshipping, but with local customization. So these were not, it comes across, they were not really Greek gods, but general gods that were worshipped everywhere. Now, in North Africa or in Africa, in Libya, they worship the same gods. But they had some specific local, for example, they used to worship the sun and the moon, but still you can't say that that was worshipped only in Libya or Africa. If you go to Arabia, they worship the moon. If you go to different part of Asia, the sun was worshipped a lot. To the Romans, they worshipped the sun. So this was still also gods that were worshipped everywhere. There are also there's this tribe of the Herodotus called Asamoneans, who they gave him information that some of their young men did travel to the south, to maybe to now to the tropics, and they met these dwarfish people. And I've mentioned in another video that Herodotus creates this impression that the tropics of Africa to the south was occupied by only dwarfish people. There were no tall people. The tall people were in Ethiopia and the surrounding land, and then Libya. And these people told them those people practiced sorcery. Herodotus doesn't give us detail of what that entailed, or he didn't get information about that maybe. Yeah, so religion in North Africa was not, or in Africa, it seems to me, was not like independent of the religion of the rest of the world, even before the arrival of Christianity and Islam. That's what becomes clear when I read Herodotus' book, Histories.